I go through phases with PUBG. Sometimes I'll play a few games, have a terrible time, and then just don't play it for a few days. Then all of a sudden, I'll just have this massive desire to play the game again, and the games will go fantastic. It's great. That being said, a lot of matches in PUBG can be a bit of a snooze fest, especially in squads if you don't go straight for some of the more player orientated areas like Novo, Georgia Pole or Millbase. And I've noticed that School isn't perhaps as popular as it once was. It's definitely fallen on hard times. It will be back though. So what would you change about PUBG if you could? I know that's a pretty open-ended question and most people would have a different answer. Perhaps it would be the red zone. Who even wants that anymore? Maybe it would be weapon balance, although I think that it's in a pretty good place right now. What about performance? Well, that's still very sketchy, but for me, it's pretty simple. I think the main change that I'd want to make is to the mid-game, and by mid-game I mean that I would love to see some changes implemented into the game that could improve the amount of players that were alive after the first circle or first phase. One of the worst parts of PUBG for me is looting, and then having to run for 20 minutes without seeing any other players. Now distance is one thing because we have a new map that's much smaller that's designed to create more battles across the map and more frequently, and Savage, which I'm going to call it, or Sarnock, which is its official name. That being said, even the smaller map still suffers from some mid-game problems. It's certainly not immune to them. And I think that this is the issue, if you want to call it that. When the plane's trajectory hits over a certain line, players always want to head to the same places, the built-up areas that offer a good chance of loot and a good fight. When you're looking at Erangel, that's the first map, you're thinking of places like School, Apartments, Novo, Millbase or Georgie. Other big towns may also be along the line and may end up being busy like Severny or Lipovka. And where players choose to go is largely based around the plane, which of course is different every time. The problem with this though is that it means that players tend to flock to the same areas depending on the plane. Some planes allow players to get pretty far and spread out because they offer a lot of choice on where you can go. Other planes, however, make this far trickier and will inevitably group up players a lot more. And what then happens is that 20 or 30 players are all fighting over a built-up area and a large percentage of them will die. Sure, some people make it out alive, others will grab a car and perhaps go and loot somewhere much safer away from the plane. A few squads will also try and pick somewhere secluded, but if you watch the plane, often there's always one area on either of the maps that players will flock to. How do you fix that? Does it even need fixing in the first place? I don't think that this is just a PUBG problem though, I think it's a Battle Royale problem. Again, I would use the word problem because I personally see it as one, but not everyone would agree. Take somewhere like Tilted Towers in Fortnite for example. When that was introduced, the amount of players that would jump there on solos was insane. It felt like half the server was there at some point, and a significant amount of those players are going to die. That's fun for some people though. If you're one of the ones that goes to Tilted or Military Base, for example, in the case of PUBG, and you come out alive, you've killed loads of players, then you've definitely had a really good early game, and you'll be pretty pumped. If you're the one that didn't land there though, chances are you're going to have a bit of a bland game until towards the end. Now you could argue, well, that's your own fault. If you want action, then you need to jump with everyone else, and although that's true, early action and playing smart to win the game don't always go hand in hand, unless you're someone crazy like Shroud who can just land wherever he wants and clear it out. One of the reasons that I personally don't like dropping to those high population areas at the start of the game is that they tend to be much laggier in terms of netcode. It just feels like it grinds to a halt. And also the frames per second that you get, it's just so low right at the start of the game when you've got so many people dropping into such a small area and opening doors, looting. It just feels really horrible to go to those high pop areas at the start of the game. Maybe that will improve as the game goes on, but at the moment it's pretty nasty. So from my point of view, I just don't like doing that, and I always try and go off the beaten path and find somewhere that's a bit more out of the way. Either way, is there a solution to this, what I call problem? Well, I think there are a few ways that you could make the middle part of the game or mid-game more exciting, and that involves changing the way that players drop into the level. Right now you've got one line, one plane. It's even shown on the map so you know in advance where it's going to head. But what if there were two planes on different trajectories and you were put randomly on one of them? Perhaps one is at the southern part of the map and the other in the north, and it forces the server to split, at least somewhat, and instead of lots of players dying early on in one built-up area, it forces lots of smaller battles across the map, and then, because of the circle mechanic, pushes all of those players inwards as the game goes on. Now that idea is all well and good, but I think that we can go one step further. But I don't think everyone would approve. Check this out, what if instead there was no plane and you were just dropped at random in the sky and you had to pick a spot on the map to fly to based on your location? Ideally, the entire server would be spread out as much as possible, and while certain areas would still have lots of players flocking towards them naturally, for the most part I think with this mechanic the server would be spread out enough to try to give constant battles. Of course, if you were playing duos or squads, then you'd both be dropped into the same area, otherwise that would be ridiculous really, having teammates spread out all across the map. But the downside of this is of course that players love to drop in certain areas in Battle Royale modes, and they don't want to lose that control. When you see the route of the plane, you can make your own decision where to go as a solo or with your teammates, even choosing to jump for a car if need be. If you were randomly dropped into the world, you definitely lose an element of that choice, and another team for instance could get better control over certain areas just because they've happened to have looked into a certain airdrop. You may love dropping into military zone, and most of the planes at least go somewhere near it. If that option was taken away from you, then perhaps you wouldn't be too happy with that. The flip side of this, though, is that I guess it forces players to adapt, and it stops players from heading to the same places over and over and ensures that they've got to think on their feet and pick new places to loot. After all, loot in PUBG isn't based on area. There is as much chance to get any loot no matter where you are on the map, and now with level 3 helmets being on airdrops only, where you land is arguably much less important now. And I think this isn't something that we can say would 100% work, because in theory or on paper, something might sound like it works, but with the human element, it may in fact not improve anything at all. But I'd love to see this method tested. After all, they do have the test server and the experimental server, so I'd like to see the PUBG devs experimenting with different spawning and dropping mechanics in the game. Maybe even a custom game mode where there are no planes but random drops instead. Use it as a test to see how players like it, and if there is actually any data and a difference in player numbers mid-game. Or, you know, perhaps it could be that testing a system like this would mean that various battles across the map would drop the player numbers down just as much as one big battle in a central area. As I said, the new map Savage definitely improves the amount of gunfights you get into because the map is much smaller, and that's something that I think a lot of players enjoy. But even on that, you still see a lot of people dropping at the ruins and the training centre because they're just very popular areas that are quite central. To be fair, when playing Savage, almost any part of the map is reachable though by the plane, so players do have a choice where to go for the most part, but there is still a desire from a lot of players to just go into the busy areas as quick as possible, and there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what players want, then who am I to say different, but it definitely does make the mid-game a bit more boring. PUBG often suffers from running simulator syndrome, and I think if you were to ask like 100 players what their least favourite thing about the game was, I think most of them would say the performance or the netcode. I also think that a lot of them would say sometimes you just end up running for 10 to 15 minutes with nothing happening and it just becomes really unengaging. It's definitely one of the biggest problems that PUBG has. And let's just have a quick word about the red zone too. Do we really need that? Does it actually offer anything to the game other than being very annoying and incredibly loud? I don't think it gives anything back, and I can say with relative certainty that most of the player base would not be sad if the red zone was removed. They probably wouldn't even notice. And I've seen a lot of players, some pro players, show dislike for the red zone, although they usually have it turned off in their competitive matches, but nothing seems to have been done, so perhaps Bluehole are reluctant to get rid of it for whatever reason. It's not even like most of us get killed by it. I've perhaps been killed no more than 3 or 4 times in over 500 hours of playing PUBG. You'd have to be pretty unlucky to be killed by it, but at the moment in its current state, I think it's just more of an annoyance. I'm not a fan, I don't know what you guys think anyway. In conclusion, back to the original topic of this video, I don't think that everyone would like to see changes to the way that we spawn in on PUBG, and that's fine, but I'd like to see it tested or even put as a custom game mode to at least see if it improves the overall experience and especially the mid-game. What's going to be fun though is seeing all of the new Battle Royale games announced this year and all the new modes announced and see how they handle the spawning system. Fortnite pretty much copied exactly the same way that PUBG does it. So I'm excited to see some games do different things there. So let me know what you think down in the comments below on those ideas. And if you enjoyed the video, give me a like, thank you. If you didn't like it, dislike it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you in the next one.